Salman?
No, I think, again, I mean, this is one of the problems we have with language. I mean, like as I mentioned, fundamentalist has particular connotations about literalist readings and things like that. And of course, there's a variant in that. Most of the groups that we, for example, used to call fundamentalists, like the Iranian Revolution. Now, in many ways, what's happened in Iran since the revolution, you actually have a working election system. You have, until the last election, more women in Iranian parliament than you had in Britain. You have many kinds of things that people don't know about. Now, at the same time, you have something like Saudi Arabia, which is considered to be non-fundamentalist, even though it doesn't allow women to drive, and the difference between the Saudis and the Taliban in terms of their interpretation of Islam is very narrow. So the question, again, comes down to what we understand by fundamentalism, again, tends to become colored to whether it's a political agenda, whether it opposes a certain set of ideas and ideals. For example, why is it that Hezbollah has so much support in southern Lebanon? Because they carried out a war against occupation. You can't just dismiss these ideas and simply say, well, these people are wrong. Most of these people actually have an innovative reading of the Quran and the texts rather than just a literalist reading.
Well, before we go on to see what we can do about it, you made a point, William Dalrymple, I don't know if it was in your book or an article, but you certainly made it, that the talk about East-West is rather undermined by the fact that Christianity, and I would have thought Judaism too, could be described as Middle Eastern religions. So the three great world religions we're talking about, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I had a discussion yesterday with three people, each of us talking about Joseph, and it really was, one was a Jewish Englishman, one was a Muslim Englishman, and it was me, and they said, it's my Joseph, no, it's my Joseph, it's my Joseph.
It's all of our Joseph.
Yeah, but
that's that's the point, it is all of us.
Yeah. And what does that give us then? If we go in from that point of view, what does that do in terms of attempting this process of unifying?
I think it's very, very important to take in the fact that we're all converts to Middle Eastern religions. You were asking how much can you take Jesus to be God and how much is he man? And the endless variations. The Aryans believed one thing, the Nestorians believed another, and Islam's attitude to Christ was very, very similar to the Aryans and the Nestorians.
Hans Kuhn actually said that in some ways Islam is Semitic Christianity.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry to be the sort of negative voice here, the party people at this table, because that's usually used as the way in for a benign message of world unity. We're all children of Abraham, and the Prime Minister used it in his famous conference speech. I'm sure that's such a positive way in for this reason, which is there's no war more vicious than a civil war, and there's no people who argue and fight more viciously than members of their own family. And the idea that this is somehow we're all from a very narrow patch of the Middle East, which all these three religions are, actually to me seems a recipe for even more suffocating and tension and conflict. Actually, we need to have this, in a way, the distance, or the respect rather, that comes with some distance, to say that's you and that's what you do, this is us, this is what we do, and we respect them rather than sort of cramping up against each other in the way that being a sort of a fratricidal family.
Salman, what's your view of this?
I think I probably agree more with Jonathan around this matter. I think having similar roots doesn't actually make the problem less intense, the conflict. It actually makes the possibility of conflict more greater in many ways. I think what we need really is, I think we started with a point, is a movement away from where you have one kind of cultural formation which is used as a way of understanding everything else. And that is, I think, is really what's the issue here. That to understand that the Muslim experience quite often gets interpreted as when Europe looks into the mirror and sees its past. So we talk about all the kind of metaphors of medievalism, superstition, violence, all the dark ages, etc. And that comes from this kind of gaze.
If the sanctity of life is shared by secular humanists
and that has never stopped
and
warfare,
by all of the religious faith traditions, however, the people that perpetrate the crimes, like September 11th, have a blatant disregard for the sanctity of life. This is a human problem.
What about the other...
This is not a religious problem. It's not rooted in any individual religious group. I think what we're dealing with is an element of humanity, but it's an extremely small element. And the problem is we're allowing a very small group of people to suddenly dictate the world's agenda. And I think we have to recognize that.
I think what we have to recognize is that in terms of conflicts that we talk about, unless you want to go into this idea that it's all to do with individual psychologies and for human beings, that we just have a propensity to have war, which is one way of thinking about it, we have to recognize that having common values, having these agreements doesn't necessarily bring about notion of peace. Before you can talk about crimes, you have to have an agreement on what is law and what is just. And unfortunately, the level of world politics, that isn't that clear cut. So you can't just simply say this act constitutes constitutes a crime and the other one doesn't, without having some notion prior to that of the law.
On paper, it is very similar. I think in practice is where the problems emerge.
Well, no, because
I don't think
Western
concepts of justice are not dissimilar to Islamic concepts of justice.
It's not a question of concept of justice. It's the question of this. What actions do we consider to be illegitimate, and what reasons? Is it the case that what happens, again, this is the kind of very kind of trite notion, that who actually does the writing of history about what was just or unjust? And this, it seems to me, is a very important thing. We can't simply say that Hiroshima, for example, when the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima, innocent civilians were killed. It's an act of war. But we have American generals saying they did not want the bomb to be dropped exactly for the reasons because it would kill innocent people. But it is an act that we've managed to live with, in a sense that it's become. So it seems to me that we have to be very, very careful that we're dealing with political concepts which themselves are contested. And theology doesn't help us in that matter because it becomes subject to contestation.
I'm going to come back to practical matters in this very last furlong of the program, as it were. People, to get out of this, there are practical measures that could be expedited. Now let's take the broad brush. Jonathan Friedland, do you think that America changing its foreign policy, giving up its demands on the terrorists, do you think that would change things? There is a view that, look, American foreign policy is at least 50%, maybe more, to blame for this. Change the foreign policy, change the situation.
Yeah, this is the view, quoting Mao, that, you know, you can't catch the fish, but you can drain the sea in which they swim, and the sort of sea of grievances that enable or lead people to be recruited to Osama bin Laden's banner are really more or less the three demands he made. I mean, he didn't phrase them as demands, but an end of support for Israel in its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, although I think bin Laden would like to see Israel eradicated from the map altogether rather than just that. But let's say that. Second, American troops out of Saudi Arabia. And third, an end of the war on Iraq. Now, the interesting thing is all three of those actually have good arguments on their side anyway. The problem is they've now become bin Laden's shopping list, and I just don't see how the United States or actually anybody else in the so-called world community can be appearing to jump to his tune. I mean, the settlement that has taken 30 years in Northern Ireland may, in a way, reflect what was on the shopping list of the IRA 30 years ago. But the very fact that it was on their list meant it took 3 decades for it to happen, because otherwise you look as if you're giving in to terror. So I think there's a real problem there. The other thing I would just add very practically is something that can be done, is that people are in the so-called West are going to have to learn about Islam.
I'm looking for practical solutions now as we enter this thing. I mean, I'm looking. I mean, that's ridiculous. But I think we should try to move towards that, right? If you said to Bush, look, if you 3 things you could do, if you could do anything you wanted and they would happen within a year, 6 months or so, these are the 3 things you should set off doing. What would they be?
I think that they would be so impractical as to waste my breath saying them. Really? So I'm not going to. But what I would like to see...
That suggests a certain hopelessness.
Well, I don't want to be hopeless. I have 4 children, and like many people, I want a future for them. I don't want to see the world descend into a conflagration that, once it gets out of hand, we can't put out the flames. And in a sense, we are pulling a genie out of a bottle that might be very, very difficult to get back into, and I think we should all be deeply aware of that. If I did say anything, I would say that business as usual has to stop. I really believe that the politicians have to, the Christians would call it metanoia. They have to make a repentance. I think that they need to, in Greek it means change your mind. And I think that the Machiavellian approach to world politics is no longer viable after September 11th. So that's what I would say.
What are its practical manifestations?
The type of spin, the type of cynicism, the type of damage control, the type of Wills in America called Palestine. He said, Palestine is not a problem because problems have solutions. Palestine is a mess, and messes are managed. I think that type of approach, a cynical approach about human conditions that affect millions of people is no longer acceptable. So I would say that there has to be a deep change, and I would hope that we reject Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. It's an unacceptable, untenable proposition.
Can I just drop in one thought about that, which is that often we focused, I think, on, and I did in my answer to your question about what the West should do. Part of this process, and I think we're hearing it from the 2 Muslims around this table, is a process of introspection in the Arab and Muslim world. Partly there is a force to blame in the sense of American and other colonial powers who stopped those countries getting democratic open regimes and societies, but to wonder why it is that across that whole whole swathe of the world, there aren't yet the democracies, the open societies, etc., that have been allowed to grapple with modernity. I think there's a large amount of blame on America for propping up these vile regimes, but there has to be some soul-searching on both sides of this process.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly.
There's a very simple reason. For example, in Algeria, when the FIS won an election in '94, the military junta suspended the election. We did not have a major complaint about democracies. You don't have demands for democratization in Saudi Arabia being initiated by the United States. Now, for example, the complaints about the Taliban regime and its misogynist policies is coming out. But what similar policies have been operating in Saudi Arabia for many, many years, you could argue. Similarly, like a
but that is the kind of thing I'm talking about. People are not going to tolerate that much longer, I think.
But I think the problem really comes down to is this, that you ask why we don't have democracies in there. I think the question is, what does democracy actually mean? And I think perhaps one we should recognize that perhaps in many of the so-called third world, democracy may be a tainted currency because it has always been possible for some countries to enjoy democracy at the expense of others having to endure dictatorship. And perhaps that's some of the things that we need to get away from.
William Dalrymple.
Well, I think there's been a denial in the US that, you know, that Middle Easterners dropping bombs in America has anything to do with American Middle Eastern policy. And the thing which, you know, the wound certainly that seems to be felt most keenly across the Islamic world is continual and often ridiculous support by America for Israel. When you see America vetoing resolutions to send observers even, just observers, to see what's happening to the Palestinians, when America steps in and uses its power to veto something so completely controversial, when that happens over and over again, when they see it being funded, this is the wound which suppurates most widely. Which, I mean, the thing about the US troops in the Hejaz, that's a specifically Saudi grievance. I've never heard people in India complaining about that. But you do find Muslims in India complaining about Palestine. It is something that really means something to them, rightly or wrongly. It's something that really hurts.
Jonathan.
Well, I'm slightly doubtful about the Muslims across the whole of the Muslim world. I know that, for example, Kashmir is a hotter issue in India and in Pakistan than Palestine is. I also just think this is part of the problem because, of course, if you're Palestinian, and frankly, even if you're a Muslim, you care about the mistreatment of Palestinians. You should. But I think instead that often gets interpreted into this is the source of all our problems. We live under a military dictatorship here in Pakistan because of Palestine. We live in desperate unemployment in Morocco because of Palestine, and we're in, to use that cliche, the dark ages in Afghanistan somehow because of Palestine. This to me seems to be an absolute diversion, and it doesn't hold up.
It doesn't hold up for all their problems, but it does hold up.
But dislike the US for propping up their own vile regimes, as well as disliking them for what they do with them.
Jonathan, one thing you're being slightly unfair about is that, again, the support for Palestine by the United States also means support for regimes that support Israel de facto, and that's one of the kind of arguments that goes around. So the reason why the Saudi royal family is allowed to get away with X, Y, Z, or Mubarak is allowed to win an election with 97% without a comment that actually elections with 97% are something even New Labour can't manage, so there must be something going on here, without even a comment like that, suggests to me that Mubarak is essential to maintain a certain Israeli policy. The United States policy towards the Muslim world as it exists largely is concerned about its relationship with Israel.
See, again, I'm afraid that's just it's a delusion, because obviously it has an oil interest across the whole of this vast region. Well, you're right, the support for Israel is part of it, but it props up Saudi Arabia, not because of his support for Israel. Saudi Arabia is no supporter of Israel, I'll break that news to you. It's about oil. And of course America props up those regimes. That's bad enough. You don't need what I think of as this slight diversionary tactic, which I admit, I think William's right. It's huge in the Muslim world. I slightly question how wise it is for a world that, from everything we've heard from Hamza and you, needs desperately some soul-searching and a process of change to just latch onto this one issue.
I think we do on all sides. I think the West, we need to become introspective in the West, and I think Muslims need to become introspective. I really think we all need to take a good look in the mirror, you know, as a global community.
Well, we have to end somewhere, and that's a good place to end. Thank you very much, Jonathan Freedland, Salman Saeed, William Dalrymple, and Hamza Youssef.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Position.